survey vessel. Got loads of screens. So I'm just going to set my timer so that I also don't massively overrun. Right, hello everyone. Thanks for staying to the end of the session. I think it's an interesting one being stuck at as the last speaker, but I think it's an important one in this because so many of the things that people have talked about are going to be things that come up in the course of talking about AI and maritime heritage data. And it's talking about AI in particular. I know I've sort of got maritime case studies in this, but really what I hope comes through is that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the things that we encountered, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is relevant to all kinds of heritage data sets. So when Alfie asked me about this one, he said, try and do an optimistic thing, talk about the potential and all those sorts of things. And I think that's a fair question for me because I can sometimes tend to go on a bit of the cynical side of some of these tools and look at the limits of them. But I also think that trying to predict the future in a venue like this is a bit of a mugs game because this technology is moving really quickly. We're being promised a lot of things and then those promises are being walked back very quickly. So I'm going to look at them in terms of what our position is now and try and say what we can do with them and what the opportunities are for those tools. But there's some really important questions we have to sort of think about and some policies and ideas that I don't think we quite have answers to. And then just to say, is nothing that I'm going to put up or talk about as an official Historic England position. I work for Historic England, but I'm not here presenting some sort of AI policy or way the organisation is thinking about it. At any moment, Barney could sprint across the stage and tackle me because I'm going to say something that, maybe it runs against some of the things that we're talking about. But I'm here as someone who's used these and who has run into problems with them and has seen some of the places they get trapped in the data. So what we're going to go through, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction in terms of data terms and what AI tools are, just because I think that's useful, because there's a lot of misinformation in this and people use these terms interchangeably when they're not. And I think it'll be helpful for you to know what I mean when I say things like natural language processing, like AI, like machine learning, because they're not all the same thing. And then we're going to go into what the data is, what the tasks we can do with it, and I'll show you an example that came out of the Unpath Waters project, which I think will hopefully show what I'm trying to talk about. So just in terms of the key ideas, the big one is there is a difference between what we call artificial intelligence and what we call machine learning, but they are always used interchangeably. Artificial intelligence is the broad school of this thing, like this idea of getting systems to perform tasks that normally require a human. Machine learning is about training algorithms on data to do something repeatedly. Metadata is data about data. I think in a room like this where there's lots of people interested in data, hopefully some of these things come through. I appreciate I'm probably saying things people already know, but I always think it's useful to go through this. Remote sensing, tools like geophysics, bathymetry, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is underwater stuff. NMR and NMHR, I say them both. I shouldn't, but I do. We do have a National Marine Heritage Record in each of the devolved administrations. So even though it's not always that accessible and that visible, it is there. And that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of my data example. And then finally, named entity recognition, this idea of using an AI model to identify a thing in text, whether that's a person or a place or an organization or an archaeological artifact, things like that, and be able to extract that. It's based on a part of speech. And then I'd say very brief, it's actually a reminder for me to be very brief and not to ramble on about this. So a natural language processing tool uses a computer to analyze a written record. So this is what we come across a lot in heritage. I'm going to talk pretty exclusively about natural language processing. I'm not going to get too into things like computer vision and images. Again, a lot of the sort of ethical side of things and the questions are applicable to that, but I didn't do computer vision as part of Unpath. I did natural language processing on records. It uses models like BERT, which is, I think, a Google-produced model, and the LLMs like the infamous ChatGPT. That's, those are very, very comfortable working with written language. That's what they're designed for. But an important point to make in a world where we're talking all the time about artificial general intelligence and machines coming to take our jobs, none of these models actually know or understand anything. It is all about tags that are attached to words. And it just knows that that word is this thing. It doesn't know why, it doesn't know what that means. So that we don't get this idea of truth or meaning or any sort of understanding from these tools. They are very much there to just link things together and make probabilistic sort of predictions on what the next word in a sentence will be. So this is a bit of an overview of how we thought about things in Unpathed. Have I got a laser? Oh, I have. Brilliant. So really, a lot of what we've been talking about today is this end of this pipeline, this idea of how we get from the stuff we're collecting, whether that's archaeological site reports or historic records, whatever else, into something a machine can read, and a machine being a computer. This is where the infamous PDF comes in. PDFs are not here. PDFs are like way down here somewhere. They're like the worst of the worst thing. But as anybody who has worked in the British government knows, the entire system is built upon Adobe's PDF, and that's, you know, an issue that we have to deal with. But it's about getting from unstructured data to something that we can play with and we can actually start mapping and doing the more interesting things, whether that's with AI or whether it's just with sort of automation through Python scripts and linkage, which is quite exciting. Not a world I was familiar with, I'll be honest. I have a BA. I didn't do data science or anything at university. I am a field archaeologist and a diver, and then I was thrown into this world of marine heritage data, and Jack, run an AI on it. Okay, sure. Yeah, so just thinking about this as a way through, I think is quite helpful. So I put it up at the beginning. I put it up in all of my slides, even though it's a few years old now. It still does give you quite a good idea of how we get from unstructured data to something we can work with. So one of the things that I do keep coming across is this idea that more and better computers will solve this for us. We'll just be able to feed these things into a computer, and that data will suddenly be good, right? It'll suddenly be structured. It'll suddenly be tagged. That's us. That's the machine doing it for us. But it doesn't do that. Larson's book came out the year I was born, and he was talking about this idea of spending more money to make archaeological archives more accessible, more usable through new technology. I'm 33 this year. You know, it's been a long time of having that same conversation. And actually, in the literature that we've gone through for Unpath and some of the stuff that we wrote about, that same argument came up basically every decade. Of we need to do something about this data. We need to actually make it accessible, make it usable. So we know this is a thing we have to do. And I think this connects to something that came up in Keith's talk, this idea of where are the data skills, where is the data literacy, right? This idea of post-excavation is a really good point. So actually, how do we get from the stuff we're collecting to an interpretation and understanding of that data? This is part of that, making that data readable, usable, consistent across all our applications. And I'll come back to that idea a bit later. So what do I mean when I talk about marine heritage data? So this is just a quick run through. The big one is the National Marine Records, the National Marine Heritage Record. So there's one for each devolved administration, so England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, sorry, Scotland, Wales, and the Isle of Man. England's is the largest, even though Scotland has the longest coast. I'll show you a map that will sort of hopefully explain that a little bit, because that's a really interesting fact. And bluntly, there are two types of records in them. There are documented losses, which is reports of something that sank, and then there are records of things on the seabed. There are way more records of things that sank that we don't have any physical remains for than there are things on the seabed, which is really weird and also a real problem when we then try and teach an AI about things on the seabed, because yeah, trying to get again, this is the idea of it'll only learn from the data we give it. Well, if we only give it data about things that sank rather than actual archaeological sites, it learns about things that sank. Prehistory and landscape is almost completely absent. We do not have a really good understanding of what is going on in terms of submerged landscapes, peat forms, those sorts of things. We do in a developer-led context. We do from that sort of work, but that doesn't make its way into the National Marine Heritage Record yet. So there are complexities with enhancing and expanding that, because it's really expensive to work underwater, like really expensive, and really hard to collect that data. So you know, this is a big issue for the national record. But what is happening is an increased expansion in nationally significant infrastructure. This is the offshore wind sort of stuff, that conversation you hear all the time about big wind farms going in offshore. That generates a huge amount of marine data about things on the seabed, right? And that's being done by a mixture of geophysical firms, archaeologists, and so on. But getting hold of that can be really difficult because there's lots of big legal constraints between the leaseholder, the contractor, who they're allowed to share their data with, where that data should then go. In theory, it goes into the Crown Estates Marine Data Exchange. Can anybody guess what goes into the Crown Estates Marine Data Exchange? If I had to press you. That's right, it's a PDF. That's what goes in, and a PDF. And at the end of that PDF are a whole load of images that have been taken from a geographic information system. So that data is somewhere, but it's going into but it comes to us in a PDF, and that's very, very hard to read and get that information back out of. And it's also completely absent the key metadata that we would like in order to be able to develop some of these things. And it also includes those things about submerged landscapes, prehistory, not just shipwrecks. I'm a shipwreck nerd. Okay, I don't care, but like lots of other people do. They want, flints and cool things about the human past. The final one is museum collections and archives. And this is a really interesting one because it's wildly varied, basically depending on how big your museum is and how big their budget is and how well supported they are. There's a huge amount of pressure on museums and archives to digitize stuff. And the responsibility for that is falling on people whose job never was to be massively computer literate and deal with these data sets and deal with the tools that we're asking them to, make a 3D model of that thing, put it online, make it so that everyone can access it, make sure it's the best quality possible. Also, digitize that entire paper record over there and make sure that we can search through it and it has character recognition, all those things. It's a huge challenge for museums who are already stretched in terms of what their budgets are and things they can do. But there are massive possibilities for us to link to those collections if we can find a way to get that established. And there are sort of easy routes to that, which we can talk about later if people would like me to. But the other question for a museum is how do you use an AI? Because it's very difficult to curate what that thing's output is going to be. And as we'll see with some of the tasks that I'm about to get to, what we actually ask of that AI and what we can make it do is really, really difficult. So how long have I got? I've got about 10 minutes. This is good. So what can we make it do? This is a big text slide. Everybody ready? So there's loads and loads of things that we, as heritage professionals, archaeologists, museum people, would like an AI to do. Some of them are really cool and really useful, and we can look at them and go, yeah, that's really obvious. Some of them, in the context of a world where sort of our post-tech skills are more limited, our ability to sort of to QA that interpretation is maybe not where we'd like it to be, are a little bit more worrying. This idea of like, if we train an AI, it can start to suggest how we might fill in that record for us, all those sorts of things. Do we really want that? That's what they can do. That's what they're being marketed as being able to do. But when we think about what our records speak to, there's some really, really challenging things in there as well. So just to run through very quickly, the top sort of 3 or so are kind of our pretty generic, yes, we would like this. It gets a little bit more complicated as we get down here. And then when we get to the very bottom, this is where it really depends on how good our data is, this idea of topic modeling and linking of records. It really depends on A, do we have an endpoint we can link to and from, which in most cases we don't, and B, is our data good enough to let us get at those topics and those entities that are in there, because often it's very thin. And I'm thinking mainly here about the National Marine Heritage Record. We do have description fields, but they often are quite light on things like people and names and stuff like that, which is what we would really like to get to some of this stuff. The other thing to think about is that none of these models that I'm talking about, whether it is Google's BERT or OpenAI's GPT or Anthropic or anything else, are a blank slate. They have all been trained on something. They're all coming preloaded with these ideas and biases. Google's BERT was trained on the US police's database of criminals and all sorts of that. It has very, very questionable decisions about people and who they are and what certain characteristics mean and all those sorts of things. And there's just a massive filter put on, like, that's been nailed onto the end of it to make sure it's not too, explicit about certain things. Is that really what we want to be feeding our data into? It's a good question. And it's something that we've got to think about in a world where we're not being given this information. We can't see inside those models. There's loads of examples of this in more explicit terms, and I recommend Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI, if you are interested in this, if you are being sort of asked to work more with AI in heritage collections, because she goes into this quite a lot and shows how museum collections and libraries were used in the training of these models, and actually how little QA went into some of that, because it was just a question of get as much data as possible, teach the model to identify people, teach it to identify certain characteristics, and go from there. I am not one of these people who thinks AI is coming to take our jobs. I think AI is coming to take some of our work. Hopefully it'll be the boring bits that are really annoying to do and require a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of spreadsheet stuff. Because there's always going to be that need, or there should always be that need, for an essential human specialist in this. right? Someone who can actually read that thing, who can actually QA what the record is that it's spitting out, who actually knows the technical backgrounds of these things. And hopefully that's really evident for some of the tasks I just shown. Hopefully, I think if there's any museum curators in the room, they might have looked at some of those and gone, well, I wouldn't want it to just do that without me being able to look at it. And whatever data we give the model is going to contribute to the way it's trained. And before we go into my sort of use example, I'll talk about it a little bit here, because in England's National Marine Heritage Record, there's an awful lot of merchant ships going to Africa, labelled as merchant ships in the sort of 18th and 19th century. They're not labelled as what they actually are. And the word for an enslaved person is not used in that record. So if you were to train an AI on that, it wouldn't recognise that that facet of history even existed. Right? That would never surface in that record. And that's really interesting. Me as a marine specialist, or in fact any of you probably would read that record and go, I know what that is. Why haven't they just written it in the record? Good question. Probably because it's actually been drawn from, the National Marine Heritage Record has actually been drawn from another historic record, most of which is around sort of loss and casualty returns that were published in newspapers and things like that. So the language there is quite interesting, and looking at how those records have evolved as they've gradually made their way into what is now being used as a heritage record is another interesting question, and a conversation that I think we probably should have. So in my last sort of 3 minutes, I'm going to take you through the big use example from Umpathed Waters. So there we go. So this is my big map of the National Marine Heritage Record. And when I say national, I mean UK. So this is a good thing why I'm not here talking as a Historic England person, because I'm not trying to suggest Historic England has any sort of claim to all of the marine data in the UK. But this gives you some idea of what is currently held by all of the devolved heritage agencies. There are a couple of things that I hope are quite obvious. So one is, if you look at Scotland and Wales, and actually Northern Ireland to an extent as well, their data goes a long way offshore. And then you get to England and we sort of follow this 12-mile line all the way around. Now, Marion talked about this a little bit earlier, this idea that actually Historic England is now pushing towards getting to that 200 mile offshore, which is going to end up sort of coming all the way around here, all the way out here. That's the project I'm working on now, is to try and pull this data in from a mixture of government sources and also from the development sector to try and fill that in. But you can see there's a lot of stuff on this map. The interesting thing about it is all the blue are records of where things were lost. And I know it looks like there's more red than blue, but that's because the blue points are what we call named locations. They're where ships were lost. There's hundreds under each blue point. So what actually is in that national record is that many things on the seabed and over 60,000 records of things that have gone missing, sunk, lost, not returned, etc. And this gives us a really interesting question in Umpathed of saying, okay, actually, what are we talking about when we get to this record? What are we trying to do? We were actually working across a historic record, not an archaeological record. And the task really became, what can we actually pull from that to teach us about the UK's marine heritage record? So this is really interesting. I know that's not quite in order. I've only just noticed that's really bad. But if you look at what periods our features are falling under, it's a lot of historical data. Now, there's some interesting things about this as well, which is that if you ask a model to look for medieval, and you also have early medieval and post-medieval in the same thing, if you're just using something like a regex, regular expression thing, it will just pull everything with the word medieval, put it under the same thing, and then it'll duplicate it for all of those, for your post-medievals. So some of these spikes we have to look at a little bit carefully, because it's, again, depends on how that record was collated. But what you can see is that everything really is historical data, or a loss or a record of something in a historic period. We have almost nothing for the earlier periods, which is actually, from a sort of site significance point of view, that's the really interesting stuff that you look at and go, this is really, really important, and things we don't have a good understanding about. Our postmodern, our post-medieval and modern stuff, yes, we're talking about significant historical events, but from an archaeological point of view and a technological point of view, we have a really good understanding of those sites. And we have a lot of those already in things like the list and in the Marine Heritage Record. So this is what we started to get to with Unpath, is this idea of being able to draw out some of the minutiae of a record that is, on the surface, very, very complete. Okay, yes, there's some legal reasons why that only goes to 12, and that's a bit patchy. There's a lot more out there than is on the record, but is quite a big record. But the reality is something that, there are other charts I can show as well, but we're running out of time, around craft type, around what the roles of those vessels were, what representation is of different parts of the marine system in that data record, and the point I already made about slave ships and their appearance, particularly when you consider what the ports that they're departing from, what they're sort of most famous for. So just to wrap up, because I am out of time, there's a huge opportunity in heritage data sets, whether it's marine or otherwise. I talk about marine, but there's more than that, to develop AI tools and to actually produce useful things that can make jobs like entering data into the HER easier, more streamlined. But there's big questions about what happens to the data we feed into those models. I didn't even have time to get into this idea of what actually we're offshoring data to big American companies on the promise of a tweet from a tech billionaire that he won't use our data to train things, which is really interesting. That's a really interesting model for us to be using. None of them know anything about archaeology. It requires that specialist input. Even if you train it on a heritage data set, it still doesn't really know anything, and it's still that role of someone actually checking it, monitoring these things. So yeah, hopefully that was useful. I'm here around to answer any questions after this, so thanks very much for your time.